the Shelf. I'm your host, Yvonne Wolf, and today our special guest and Glenview resident is Ward Wilson. He's a senior fellow at the Federation of American Scientists in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Ward.
Thanks, Yvonne. It's nice to be here.
I met you through your neighbor, Ray de la Cruz.
Ray is a wonderful guy.
Yes, you have such different books, right?
Well, we do write about different things.
And you write from home? You don't...
I occasionally go to Washington, but mostly my work requires research and writing and occasional trips, so I can work from anywhere, essentially. And we chose Chicago, and Glenview is turning out to be a wonderful place to live. I especially like my neighbors.
Well, let's talk about the 5 myths of nuclear war. Weapons, I'm sorry.
So in 2013, I published a book called 5 Myths About Nuclear Weapons. It's a relatively short book. It was published by Houghton Mifflin. They were the first publishing house that my agent approached, so I was very fortunate that way. And the 5 myths are, if I can remember them, that nuclear weapons didn't force Japan to surrender at the end of World War II, that nuclear weapons are not decisive weapons of war, right, that nuclear weapons have not kept the peace for 60 years. There's one other one. And that we cannot get rid of them. I can't remember the 4th one.
Well, tell us about how you've been working on this, right? You have many, many years of research behind the small book, but it's a very good primer. It's a very compact reading.
I guess I got started in 1962 when I was 6 years old, and I noticed that all the adults around me, particularly my parents, were just as scared as, they were more scared than I had ever known adults could be. Mm-hmm. And I asked my mom what was wrong, and she said there were bad men who had put missiles in an island 90 miles away from the United States, and that those missiles could come down out of the sky at any time and blow up everything. And of course she was talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis and nuclear missiles. And I can remember as a 6-year-old standing in the front yard of our house, it was cloudy that week in New Jersey, looking up into the sky to see if I could see the first faint specks of the missiles as they came in to destroy everything. And I must have been deeply scared, and I think that emotion stayed with me long afterwards. But I also, I think a secondary thing I learned from that is that it's remarkable that my mother told me about this. I mean, tell a 6-year-old that there might be a nuclear war.
Yes.
But I
Imminent
learned
death for everybody.
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
Everything you know.
But I learned an appreciation for facing truth, whether it's harsh or not.
Yes. Look it in the eye.
Yes. And I've tried to carry that on in my work. So then there's a long period. I grow up and I go to college and I spend 30 years doing different things, but I was also at night and on weekends studying nuclear weapons, reading the masterworks, writing articles that never got published and papers that never saw the light of day. I have 8 linear feet of notes and drafts of unpublished things. So.
That's very humbling to know, because that's probably what all authors deal with, that you have more written than what gets published.
It's a writing, like anything else, you don't become an expert until you put in your 10,000 hours or whatever it is. So,
yes.
I mean, some people are brilliant and they have a voice when they're quite young and they can tell stories, and that's tremendously amazing, and I admire them. I can't do that.
Well, this is a different narrative where it's not a storytelling. I feel you're writing this in a far more like engineering mind. You're telling us as a scientist. It's not about the going back and forth feelings. It's a very scientific look at this.
Well, it's a terribly serious topic. So if you want to be taken seriously, you have to write in a serious tone. And I struggled for a number of years to learn how to both write accessible language, but still maintain the tone that was serious.
The integrity of the topic.
Yeah.
And I feel, from what we talked a little bit about before this, that you've been talking about nuclear weapons for years before the book came to be.
I had thought about it and written about it, and then my first break came in 2007 when I published an article in Harvard's International Security, which is one of the leading journals of security studies in the world. It was my first scholarly article published in this journal that a lot of people don't get published in their entire careers.
Right.
I won a prize in 2008 for the best essay on nuclear non-proliferation. That was a $10,000 prize. And then in 2010, I got a very large grant from the Foreign Ministry of Norway to read, write, travel, and speak on nuclear weapons. So I ended up going to 23 countries on 5 continents and talking to foreign ministries and meeting a number of foreign ministers and talking to people in churches and schools.
Oh, so everywhere from the
Yeah.
people off the street to foreign ministers.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes.
So you got used to that pretty easily? Or what are some, how do you feel?
Well,
Yeah, how is it, right, to meet people and to talk about something that they're terribly intimidated by?
to be honest, talking to ordinary people is easier
Really? Okay.
because ordinary people are perfectly willing to believe that something that they've thought could be wrong. They don't
yes.
have a lot invested in the current conventional thinking about nuclear weapons. Government ministers and people, academics who've written papers and spent their lives,
Oh, yes.
their careers are committed to a particular point of view.
Yes.
So they're less willing to have an open mind.
And they may have made political decisions
Yes.
based on
Yes.
untruths.
Yes.
Ah, and that must be very hard to face,
It's hard for them, and I still don't have a good way of.
breaking it softly to them.
Yes. Yes. That's a good way to put it.
So after this tour of 23 countries, what do you feel that there's a lot more work to be done, or do you feel that
It seems to me that the problem resides primarily, the way I see it, government officials and experts in nuclear-armed states are trapped inside a mindset. They suffer from a kind of groupthink.
Yeah.
And that is informed by a series of assumptions that were made during the Cold War,
yes,
when, let's be honest, everyone was afraid, and no one does their best thinking when they're afraid. So I don't think that we should blame them for being trapped in a mindset, but it's difficult for them to get out. So primarily today, the problem resides in governments and institutions where experts on nuclear weapons work. And a lot of people in the United States don't know, but the UN passed a treaty endorsed by 122 countries calling for the banning of nuclear weapons. And so far, I think 17 countries have ratified. It takes a long time. You have to go back, and they have a debate and so on. But there's a good chance that most of the non-nuclear armed states will eventually sign on to this treaty calling for the banning of nuclear weapons. The problem is the nuclear armed states believe, I think wrongly, that nuclear weapons ensure their safety and give them status and prestige and reinforce their treaties and so on.
I see. And your book is available at the Nobel Peace Prize Library. How did it get there? Did your agent help you?
Because the Norwegians sponsored me for so many years. I've been in Norway a bunch, and I actually know some of the people at the museum, and they were kind enough to have a copy available. And in fact, in the last Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. And
I
because
see.
they know me, they invited me to come to sit in the audience at the ceremony, which was wonderful. I got to see a lot of old friends and find this copy of my book in the Nobel Peace Prize
Get
library.
used to listening to Norwegian, which I find is always fun. So did you have a technical writer or editor to help you, or?
Houghton Mifflin gave me a technical editor, but there aren't editors anymore unless you're
Yes.
writing a blockbuster.
Yeah, there's.
So I mostly had to organize and structure it. I got some feedback from friends of mine, scholars and experts, and family who read it and said, "I don't understand this. Why did you do that?"
Yeah.
or whatever. But
Editors are usually now freelance.
yeah,
right? So the publishing world has changed a lot.
it's hard to get an unconventional view pushed out there because it's so
Yes.
dangerous to publish any book for a publisher that they're less willing to take risks.
I see. And are you working on the marketing of the book, or that's not the way for you because this is a academic piece, or?
When the book was published in 2013, I got a further grant to travel around the United States and work on getting interviews, and spoke at a bunch of
Yes.
NPR radio
That sounds wonderful.
talk show.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that
it
sounds
was-
a dream for every author, no?
It was fun. But I think that it's difficult to reach a popular audience. Right now, what I'm contemplating, and I've just finished another book that is more complete. It has the complete argument. This is 120 pages, and it's
Right.
easy to read. And
Yes.
but
But it's to me, I find that it's the best length to plant the seed into changing that set, because we are not ready, the typical American down the street, to read a 300-page argument. So the primer is just to begin to recognize the thinking that we could try.
well, I hope you're right. I appreciate your saying that. But I'm considering now trying to do grassroots work, leaving writing behind or only writing part-time, and trying to encourage people to take this seriously as a political issue.
So are you working with social media, or how do you do that? Because nowadays authors tend to have to learn that
It
on
is
their own.
a challenge to learn social media, and particularly Twitter, which is can be such an angry space
Yes.
where people are so rude to each other, and
Yes.
yet, the nuclear weapons debate is supposed to be this serious, sober debate.
Yes.
So it's hard to know how to.
A scientific debate, right? As something that.
I will say that the funny thing about Twitter is that every discussion on Twitter about nuclear weapons always ends with a quote from Dr. Strangelove. I don't know why, but it does.
Science fiction fans are your audience, right?
I don't know.
So, do you find having that access to your audience, response, feedback, how are you adjusting to that? Because that's new for writers. 20 years ago, we don't hear how your book is received so instantly.
What's amazing is that I have Twitter followers and Facebook followers around the world. There was
yes.
an editorial published in the Oman Times in Oman.
Wow.
And
People have something to say all over the world
Yes.
about you.
This editor read the book, heard about it, read the book, and then wrote this op-ed about the myths of nuclear weapons. And that's amazing. And to have friends where on Facebook you're constantly clicking the translate this button.
Yes. So what did they say to me in Farsi? Right?
And my friends in Georgia are out of luck because Facebook currently doesn't translate whatever the Georgian language is to English that I get. So
Yeah. And you have more books, you tell me, what are your next works?
So the next book is Hope in the Nuclear Age. It's, I think, a complete solution to the question of how to get rid of nuclear weapons, how to eliminate them completely in a prudent, pragmatic manner.
Yes.
I think there are sensible, sound reasons to see that they're dangerous but not very useful, and that's a reason to go ahead. And I mean, if you look at the whole trend of warfare, all the advances are towards smaller, smarter, more accurate weapons. Nuclear weapons increasingly look like dinosaurs.
And drones, right?
Drones
the deliveries, right?
drones
The
are-
delivery method is very different now.
Yes, everything's different. And the nuclear weapons have always been kind of clumsy and too big, and people imagine, I think incorrectly, that a big weapon is necessarily an effective weapon. But nuclear weapons are tools, and a big tool isn't necessarily the most effective tool. If you can imagine trying to use a sledgehammer that was 8 feet high,
Right.
you'll understand that you can't always use the biggest tool.
That reminds me of what they say about aircraft carriers too. That maybe is too big for.
My friend who is sitting on the advisory board for this new group that I'm setting up is a former commander of all French Air Force, except for the nuclear component. He commanded all of the rest of the Air Force. And that's exactly what he said. He wrote an article about aircraft carriers and drawing on some of the work from 5 Myths.
That's so. When you see that kind of, I don't know, is it cost synergy, or are you excited about just reading more? I mean, you're a researcher background. Don't you just love to?
Yes, when someone takes an idea and applies it in a new way to something
Right.
that you haven't thought of, it's fabulous. It's wonderful to see, and it's interesting. It's stimulating. It makes you think, oh yeah, and battleships are like aircraft carriers. They were, the biggest thing and the most important weapon, and then it turned out they weren't that useful in World War I, and they got all sunk in World War II.
Yeah.
So.
And you feel, wow, I'm smarter than I thought I was.
Well, I was born in the Midwest.
Okay, well, let's talk about Glenview then. How do you enjoy living in Glenview?
I love Glenview. We live in a very quiet apartment complex. Our neighbors are all wonderful. Everything is handy. There's an amazing park system. I can ride my bike, There's must be 100 miles of bike trails in all directions. We can kayak in the lagoon, and there's the Arboretum nearby, and good heavens, what else could you want? There's even a little hot dog stand, a mom and pop hot dog stand where you can get ice cream cones on a summer evening.
Well, I think the environment is very supportive of the arts.
It's certainly one of the best places I have ever written.
Really?
It's got different places give a different vibe, and it's easier or harder to write in different, and I can write anywhere.
That's your work sounds like you can write anywhere, right?
I have some headphones that are noise
canceling.
Yeah, so I can sit on planes and write. But I enjoy writing in Glenview for the kind of peaceful atmosphere and the availability of all kinds of resources and inspirations.
So would you be interested in doing a talk at our library, or
I would love to do talks. Giving talks
at a high school?
At a high school, at universities in Chicago. I want to spread this message, so I would love to, and I usually bring a computer and a slideshow. So
yeah, I think you would be just the right person for Glenbrook South, where they wanted the new generation to think more critically of what they know. Yeah.
It's one of the nice things about studying nuclear weapons is that it teaches you important lessons that apply much more broadly. That you have to look at the facts. That people, even important people, can get carried away by an idea or
An impression.
An assumption, and then draw the wrong conclusion. And those conclusions can have policy implications that can affect your life.
Right, because how many times have we seen that atomic bomb going off in Nagasaki, but then we kind of forget, or Hiroshima, and then we forget all the bombings that occurred in that summer,
Yes.
and we just don't realize that. We think there was just two bombs that
That's right.
ended everything.
It's as if the mythical moment exists outside of history, and it's almost as if it's present in our lives now because the myth gives us meaning, and so it's right here with us. And when you put it in context, it looks entirely differently.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And that's where we go off on the tangent or on the wrong.
Well, we want to. There are all kinds of reasons why we want nuclear weapons to be what we imagine they are. They make us completely safe. They give us power. They give us status. They fit with the American kind of self-image. We think we're entrepreneurs and inventors. And so, of course, we invented this amazing weapon that sustains the world order and allows prosperity and,
Overwhelms our
adversaries.
yes.
Yeah, it's our ingenuity once again, winning the day. Well, that's a nice story.
I think we're losing that that status very quickly now. So Ward, you've spoken at many countries. Have you ever been in a country abroad where you felt you were used to structure some kind of argument they have in that country?
Well, for instance, I was invited to Scotland, and the Scottish, you may know, house the British nuclear deterrent. All the nuclear submarines that the UK has are based in Scotland, so they feel a little sensitive about the possibility of nuclear war since it would strike them first. And there's been a strong independence movement in Scotland. And the chief whip of the Scottish National Party invited me to come and give a talk to parliamentarians in the Scottish National Parliament, which I did. It was remarkable. There were 20 parliamentarians there, which is the largest number of parliamentarians I've ever spoken to in a single room. Of course, when the whip tells you that you have to be somewhere, I guess you go. The next day they had their debate on nuclear weapons, and perhaps not coincidentally, it was August 6th, which is the anniversary of Hiroshima.
So timely.
And they not only gave me the opportunity to suggest thoughts for both the opening and closing arguments in the debate, but one of the parliamentarians on the floor rose and recounted the main points of the book. And then at one point, the chief whip, Bill Kidd, turned around and said, and we have a very distinguished scholar, Ward Wilson, in the balcony, and he pointed to me, and it's a little like when people sing happy birthday and you don't know where to look or what to do, or,
do you bow?
Do you wave or stand up, or I don't know.
Yeah. Well, in the Scots, I know they disagree with the Brexit, so they definitely have their opposing views. They're ready for them.
But
how about domestically?
Well, I think the best experience I had domestically, where I expected there to be trouble, is that I gave a talk at the Stimson Center, and there were these two people sitting in the front, or the second row, sitting very straight, very clean cut, a man and a woman. And afterwards, one of them came up to me and said, I work with some people who might be interested in hearing some of these arguments that you make. And maybe sometime you'd like to come down and give us a talk. And I said, well, sure, that sounds great. That's fine. Here's my email. And he wrote to me a few weeks later, and he was Lieutenant Colonel so-and-so from the A-10 Directorate at the Pentagon. The A-10 Directorate is the Air Force's Office of Policy, Planning, and Strategy for Nuclear Weapons.
Wow.
So the real heart of the endeavor is at Offutt Air Force Base or in other places around where the military bases are. But the Pentagon office is a place where they deal seriously with nuclear weapons issues, and I was pretty intimidated.
I mean, so you don't go collecting business cards from other people. When you go to a talk, they just...
Well, this guy just took my card and called me up. And
so how did that go?
Well,
everybody was stars and in uniform?
It was probably 4 civilian experts.
Yes.
And then the rest were B-52 bomber pilots, which is who my host was, bombardiers, missile silo people.
Yeah.
And the fact is, we had lunch beforehand. I really got on well with the soldiers. The guy, he took me down and showed me where the 9/11 memorial was, and he talked about flying commercially versus flying a B-52 bomber, and
That's wonderful.
the bombers have so much weight of ordnance on the wings that they
Yeah.
can't tilt very much.
Right.
And so when he's in a commercial plane and they go like this, it makes him very nervous, which is funny. But we had a very good conversation. I argue pragmatically and using historical examples and facts, and the military guys really got that.
Because,
and
they have that
liked it.
background.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the civilian guys whose jobs all depend on nuclear weapons being important didn't like what I had to say at all.
Because it's very threatening. What
But
you're saying.
afterwards, the military guys took me back to their office, and we sat down, we put our hands behind our heads and feet up, and we talked for another 45 minutes, just us. And at the end, one of the senior guys said, you know, maybe nuclear weapons are not the deterrent of the future. And I felt as if, which is the most that they can do, because if you ever express doubt about your mission, then you can't fly anymore. So they have to be very circumspect about what they say about nuclear weapons. It sounded to me like we really...
What a wonderful progress you made. Well, thank you very much, Ward, for being on our program.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for watching. Join us next time on Off the Shelf.